Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, and wow, do I have a great interview for you all today, because I want to explore how Security Service Edge, or SSE, is reflecting the circumstances that organisations have had to contend with over the last 2 years. And I also want to explore the impacts of more organisations adopting SaaS offerings and data and applications continuing to be increasingly distributed outside of on-premise data centres, and what that means not just for large organisations but small to medium-sized businesses too. So today I've invited Nathan Howe from Zscaler, as we would say here in the UK, or Zscaler for my audience in the US and beyond. And we're going to talk about all this, and also why addressing ransomware will remain a priority, how hybrid working will shake up IT infrastructure, and why instant and real-time demands that we all have are going to be driving 5G and edge computing. We've got a lot to get through and an incredibly cool conversation with a great guy. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Germany, where Nathan Howe is going to talk about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure, Neil. Pleasure to be here. So Nathan Howe is my name. I'm the Vice President of Emerging Technologies and focusing on 5G here at Zscaler. So I get to play with all the really cool new stuff, like I mentioned, 5G or things like edge compute and other things like that. So it's a kind of an innovation and get to play with cool toys kind of role.
And you say you love to play with that real cool stuff, the new stuff there. But I'm curious, has it always been that way? And I suppose the only way of finding that out is going back into your past a little. How did you get here? What's your origin story? And where did that passion for tech come from? Or what lit the spark and put you on this path you're on right now?
It's a good question, actually. It's I'm a kid of the 80s. And my dad brought home an IBM clone when I was probably 8 or 9. I took it apart to his dismay, put it back together to his kind of shock, and I got into it pretty quickly. I started out trying to figure out how to play games that were not like copies of games, clones of games. Perhaps let's just say playing around with the edges of legitimacy and trying to figure out how to make games work. I remember the game my parents used to have called Leisure Suit Larry.
Yes, I remember that well.
I really got into it, into figuring out how to get around the parental control. So I guess you can say that I was learning early on to find ways around things. So I started it pretty early in trying to figure out those things, and I got into BBSs and exploring ways to get onto the internet and figure out ways to get more connected and more informed. And it was driven out of two things. One was kind of the thirst for knowledge and to see what else is out there. But I also grew up in a pretty small part of Australia, pretty isolated. And so it was always nice to be able to try and speak with people from around the world. And I found that quite exhilarating, having conversations. And I think it just expanded from there. And the technology just grew further as technology expanded. Obviously, the web came along. The web was fun. Got to do a lot of fun things there. And then moved into, for me, I moved into tech in a pretty heavy way. I grew up in information security. I worked as a pen tester in Australia. I moved over to Europe with my former company, or one of my former companies, Nestle. Moved around the world and ended up working for Zscaler. So yeah, that's a bit of my origin story, a broad one, I'm sure. Yeah,
I absolutely love that. And for any parents listening that keep telling their kids that playing video games is bad for you, I mean, you took Leisure Suit Larry and that somehow put you on a path that would lead you to Zscaler, which I believe is one of the largest cloud security platforms out there. But for people that are hearing about that for the first time, can you just tell them a little bit more about what Zscaler is and the kind of problems that you solve and what makes you different from other solutions out there?
Yeah, happy to. And I think actually probably to be very, very transparent, Zscaler or Zscaler, it doesn't really matter. We're an American company, so we say Z. As an Australian, I technically should say Z. As an Australian living in Germany, I technically should say Zscaler. Yeah. But, I've been indoctrinated into the American ways. But basically, our company name is actually indicative of what we do. It stands for Zenith of Scale. And the idea really came about when our founder decided he wanted to provide a cloud security service. And that sounds pretty common today, but 14, 15 years ago, that was unheard of. No one had really heard of cloud security. Security was very traditionally, and even today, is quite commonly centralized in a kind of, for lack of a better phrasing, castle model. So everyone has to come into the castle to be protected. You'll hear the hub and spoke or castle and moat example used by many vendors. But traditional security was that if I wanted to be protected, or my enterprise wanted to protect me, I would do that centrally in some sort of centralized infrastructure, data center location. And mainly because of the fact that everybody there was a notion of, if I shared a network, if I was on a network, that network was protected. So I'd be in the office, that was a protected network. And of course, we all know today, working from home or working from anywhere is very common. But 15 years ago, that was just the nascence of that. And we saw that not only from a user point of view, but also an application point of view. So people started trying to consume more cost-effective as well as easier to run technologies. So platforms like Salesforce and other were born out of the need that enterprises didn't want to run their entire sales organization infrastructure on SAP in-house. They needed to look at ways to be able to find a more effective way of working. And we, again, today, we see that as being normal to go to the cloud and go and get some sort of service from the cloud. But back then, it wasn't the case. And so what Zscaler really was born out of is, well, how do I now provide that layer of security when my users are no longer going to be centralized in a business, or my applications are no longer going to be centralized inside that business either? They're going to be distributed and everywhere. And the idea was, well, hold on a second. Why don't we provide a control function between the user and the destination application? So a pass-through security solution. And so that's the nascence of Zscaler, was a cloud security solution that, rather than you going from your computer onto a dedicated network, out to the internet and onto an application, you would go from your computer, wherever you are in the world, to any application you need, and at the same time pass through the Zscaler platform and allow us to do all sorts of really cool things for the company, like protection, inline controls like URL filtering, and all those fun security things like CASB and sandboxing and firewalls. But ultimately, it ended up being what we call Zscaler, and it is our branded name is the Zero Trust Exchange, in that we see ourselves as kind of a middle exchange between the user, or the source of the connection, and the destination. It doesn't have to be a person. It could be an application talking to an application, or vice versa. But the goal really is to be a transparent layer that provides the controls that you set out. And it really comes down to the idea of, well, I'm an enterprise, and I'll use Neil, I'll use you as an example and myself as another, that maybe I want to allow you to view YouTube and at the same time access an internal ERP system. Whereas I'm not allowed to access the ERP, but I can access YouTube. And so at that granular level layer, regardless of where you might be or wherever I might be, those controls are applied to us, and it makes it transparent to us. We just go about our day, and we don't care what network we're on or what location we're in. We just get access. And that is kind of the goal. And that's what we've built out over the last 15 years or so.
And what I try and do on this podcast every day is take complex technologies that people may have heard about and maybe try and demystify them and talk about them in a language that everyone can understand. And one of the reasons I was excited to get you on the podcast today was to talk about Security Service Edge, or SSE. So just to set the scene, can you offer an overview of what it is for people outside of IT and how it actually reflects the circumstances organisations have contended with over the last 2 years? Because so much has changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think you really nailed it by saying the last 2 years. I think the last 2 years put that spotlight on exactly what SSE is about, and also what Zscaler has been doing. So in its basic form, we're saying with SSE and this security service edge is that regardless of wherever the person may be or wherever the application may be, we're able to provide that user a path to securely get access to that application, at the same time make sure they're being controlled. And when I say control, not like bad girl, good boy sort of thing, but more of what are the enterprise controls that need to happen. So a good example would be, I don't want to have credit cards uploaded into a Google Drive, or I don't want someone to download a malicious file off the internet. And so the Security Service Edge really is a layer between a company's end users, an employee of a company, and the destination application that allows that organization to define the controls. Now, that is quite complicated to do when you have literally tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees, and 10 or 11, let's just say hundreds, maybe thousands of applications. And so, as I mentioned before in the Zscaler history, is we were trying to address the idea of how do we how do we address the security and risk when we have to then move to applications being everywhere and users being everywhere. And ultimately, that's just what SSE is doing. It's categorizing the appropriate way of not only ensuring policies applied, but making sure the right policies applied to the right person or the right thing. And that's really important because, as I used in the example before, Neil, you should not get the same access as me just because we share the same company. Or because we're on the same network. We should have individual granular controls applied to us based upon our jobs, our roles, our responsibilities in the organization. And SSE is stating that regardless of where you are, regardless of where you're going, and which application you're connecting to, the right controls apply to the right person in that path, and making sure that we protect not only the individual, but the business and company at hand. So think of it like a nice warm blanket that separates you inside your warm bed during the middle of winter and the outside cold weather. SSE is that layer that is appropriately controlling and protecting the enterprise and the individual from the big bad internet and other applications out there.
And of course, another big change is more and more organizations are adopting SaaS offerings. And I'm not just talking about the big companies, but I think small to medium-sized business are unlocking a whole range of opportunities by doing just that. And I think the next few years will be very interesting because of that. But how's that going to impact the data and applications that will I'll do that again. So as data and applications will continue to be increasingly distributed outside of on-premise data centers, what kind of impacts are you seeing there?
That's a good question. Because it actually gets really granular pretty quickly.
Yeah,
it's very easy to say I'm moving my application to AWS, or Azure or whatever, or even to some sort of infrastructure or even platform as a service environment, so Salesforce or Microsoft, whatever. And it's easy to do that, but then you have to consider, well, how am I going to get people to get access to that solution? And not only to get access, but how do I ensure that, to your point, that the right sort of data is being pushed up and down? A really simple example would be, personally, I run a Microsoft 365 account for my home computers, but also we use Microsoft 365 as a company. So how do I differentiate my personal traffic going to Microsoft versus my enterprise side of things? And it's not as simple as just having a network layer control. It's actually a matter of protecting those different data sets based upon the role and responsibility. And this comes back actually to a pretty simple, I say it's simple to say, idea of least privilege. And I think if we look at what SSE is trying to do and what companies will do is they face this challenge to move services to the cloud, it's very easy to go and do it. Anyone with a credit card can go and buy a cloud service. That's simple and easy. And it frustrates compliance and procurement teams throughout all organizations. But when it comes to the technology, you need to be able to differentiate personal versus private. And the key to do that is not only a matter of least privilege, as in my role defines what I should get access to, but also my role under which conditions. So if I was to have those two Microsoft tenants I mentioned before, a personal and a professional, obviously my company, Zscaler, is not interested in my personal content. That's not their responsibility. But they are interested in if I'm uploading anything that could be considered bad to Microsoft that may be of professional protection, under protection. So how do I ensure that protection of information? So that's kind of where we get into the services of control in line. And that becomes a fun topic to dive into with customers. But the area to really focus on that is, if I have something that I need to get access to, how do I apply the controls? And I mentioned least privilege. Well, my control should be only what is needed and nothing more. And if I need more access, then I need to request it through a typical service process. So when it comes to SaaS, PaaS, infrastructure as a service, or even on-premises in a good old-fashioned data center, these applications should all be seen as the same. They shouldn't be seen as this is a different service, this is a different way of controlling it. They're all applications that are being consumed. It's not about the location of where the app is, it's the application itself. And therefore, we need to apply the right controls to the right application. That becomes the fun part of the platform, or of the journey. And in terms of SSE, that's exactly what it's asking us to do, is ensuring that least privilege control for those sets of services, if that makes sense.
It really does. And I think we've moved so far in just 2 short years that we often forget just how far we've come. And if we go back 2 years ago, we were almost working from home overnight at scale. And then I remember even the Microsoft CEO saying they'd experienced 3 years of digital transformation in 3 months. And here in present day, of course, it's all about hybrid working. So I'm curious, How are you seeing hybrid work further shaking up the IT infrastructure?
It's again the hot topic item, and it's interesting to see if you look at even the likes of like the normal large conferences like an Apple developer conference or Google or whatever. The last couple of years they've tried to get back to the point of let's do it in person, but for whatever reason, so the pandemic being what it may, they still come back to the idea of hybrid. You should have the opportunity to attend if you can, and if you are meeting the right controls, you're vaccinated, you recently tested, those sort of things. Versus I need to stay at home or I can't make the trip. And I think it's the same we're seeing with enterprises when it comes to work from anywhere, that hybrid work environment. The end result ultimately is that the end experience should be as similar on premises in the office working with your colleagues as it should be remotely. And we see a lot of our customers, enterprises we've spoken to, have talked about the last 2 years has given them a shake-up as to how they view their office. And more often than not, we hear about the coffee shop model. So everybody's saying, well, we're just going to remove the whole network because we just need internet. We just don't care about the local network anymore. Let's just make it like a Starbucks. Let's make it like a coffee shop around the corner. And then everybody can use the open internet to get access, but they get access through a solution to the necessary applications. And obviously that'd be a Zscaler solution with our customers. And so the end user experience is really simple. They have the same experience they have today at home that you and I are having right now, sharing this call. And we'd have the same experience if I was in a different country, a different location, and similar to you. So the idea of making those workspaces, whether it be virtual or, of course, physical, more collaborative is a goal of enterprises. And I think that's going to be the biggest shift out of the last 2 years that I would see in terms of working from anywhere or hybrid working, is collaborative services are going to develop more and more. And that becomes really important because that's a solution on the internet. It's a solution on a network, and you have to make sure that you're providing the right controls as to who can get access and who can collaborate. And that comes back to the idea of SSE. And of course, Zscaler is that we provide those controls in line to protect that access. But then, as I said, I personally don't want to go to any one office and they're stuck to a certain network and stuck to an old internet link. I want to have a big fat pipe like I have here at home or on my 5G phone. So it becomes simple. We need to provide the simplest way for the end user to consume the services, at the same time, give them access to the services they need without being a hindrance. So hybrid for me is really about continuing what we have already seen and just making that the same experience available to end users wherever they may be it on a plane, coffee shop, at the office, wherever it might be.
And another hot topic is we've got to talk about, of course, is cybersecurity. And even last month here in the UK, a ransomware attack took down, I think it was KP, which meant hula hoops, skips and nuts are in short supply after a ransomware attack. So, and I think we often forget that a cyber attack is not just about taking a business offline. There's reputation damage, which can often affect a company up to 5 years in advance. And also GDPR and then them huge fines as well for breaches. So with all that in mind, do you think addressing ransomware will continue to be a big priority for businesses? And from the conversations you're having, do the boardroom get those risks now and the importance of it?
I think ransomware became a boardroom event when it went from being a back page kind of news item to a front page solution or topic a couple of years ago, not even before the pandemic, when we saw things like the ransomware that hit big companies around the world. I think it was 2017. 2018, something around there. And I think that was the moment everyone kind of thought, okay, this is something we have to consider at an enterprise, at a board level. So I would say that today, though, ransomware is definitely something everyone's aware of. Everyone's very much addressing it. But I would argue that addressing ransomware is not the sole goal we should be looking at. We should be looking at the reasons behind why ransomware is an issue. And there's a number of stages in this, but I think from a pure security holistic point of view, we need to look at why ransomware crews are able to achieve what they achieve today. And more often than not, it's because enterprises have something they didn't know about, a legacy A, a legacy B that's been sitting around for a long time because it was acquired or put in place by somebody. And I think one of the biggest challenges enterprises face is that when it comes to reviewing their ecosystems and knowing what they have, it's often like, oh, we have this thing, but do we need it? I don't know. That was put up by Mary 5 years ago when she left the company, and we don't know what happens anymore if we turn it off. And that risk needs to be addressed. And we call that the attack surface. and being aware of that surface, because obviously those are the things that are exposed to untrusted users. They need to be considered. So I think the biggest issue is addressing that legacy in terms of reducing that attack surface by removing exposure to the untrusted networks. And there's a number of ways of doing that. And there's technology to help. But I think the biggest thing enterprises can do is to look at and say, hey, what do I have and what do I need to make available? And if I don't need to make this available to the entirety of the internet, let's get it off the internet. And that will make a huge step forward in dealing with the risk of ransomware, but also should be a process that enterprises look at, not just externally on the internet, but internally, B2Bs, third parties. How do they address these risks? And that is beyond ransomware, no doubt, but it certainly is an important thing to address the ransomware. And then one final stage on that is once you have that visibility of these legacy or these exposed solutions, you should be looking to segment and isolate these things, not just remove them from the internet, but segment and isolate them based upon the risk and priority they have. One of my customers recently said to me, and I thought it was actually very astute, when I asked him, what are your key assets? Like, what is the key functional tools that the company has to sell their product, whatever it is? He was very quick to answer. And he said, we know, because if we didn't know what key assets we had, then we didn't have any key assets. And I thought that was really interesting. If you can't identify what your key assets are, what are the top 10, top 20 applications that your business needs to run, then you don't actually have any. Everything is considered just a generic application, and you don't have any risk or categorization of what is important to the business or not. So I think enterprises need to think about that when taking the necessary steps to go in, isolate, protect, remediate, remove, those sort of things.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story from my IT past where we uncovered a server in a data center, and it was just called Rita in capital letters, and we couldn't work out what the acronym was. Should we switch it off? What would happen if we switch it off? Long story short, the name Rita came from a guy that used to work there. That was the name of his mum. And it was he called it to house a legacy application which had long since disappeared. But as you said, man, it's just those. I think every organisation has got a server somewhere or a machine that sits in the corner that nobody dare touch, but nobody knows what it is. You can't be like that in this day and age, can you?
We can't, absolutely can't. And what is amazing is that if you look at specifically in the environment of OT has always been relatively, its operational technologies have been relatively air-gapped, and it has a lot of legacy solutions because these things have to run for 20 years and not be turned off, and it makes sense. But as we've now connected them more and more to the internet to get analytics, insights, and so forth, we still have to then contend with the risk of bringing our Windows 98 OT controller onto the network, and that brings it into the exposure of what else can see that thing. So I think it's an opportunity for customers, for enterprises, to really think about, okay, is this the time I change and move and modernize things, or is this the time I isolate? And I really think it's a matter of one or the other, depending on the business risk. Either way, isolation and segmentation should happen, but modernization is definitely driving forward, especially in OT, because they are seeing it's time to move into that environment. And that's where I think IT is having a big influence on OT. But at the same time, those legacy boxes just randomly sitting out there are more than a few and far between. There's quite a few, that's for sure. Just like Rita.
Absolutely. And I think if we look across every business, people now almost expect a standard to be able to work from any device at any time in any location with real-time insights and access to the data wherever they are. They could be sat on a beach drinking cocktails, getting information from their phone, or equally in the office or working from home. But the reason I bring that up is before you came on the podcast, I was doing a bit of research, and I was reading about your belief that instant and real-time demands that every organisation is going through at the moment will actually drive 5G and edge computing. So can you expand on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to do it using one of my favorite things in the world, which is to watch Formula One.
Yeah.
Formula One, I watch it on my phone, or my iPad, and I'm streaming it from the internet. And what's interesting, if you think about the actual content as you're viewing this, and I'm a nerd, so I think about these things. The video stream itself is not for me. It's a broadcast. It's coming to my phone because my phone requested it, but it's nothing specific for me. So I'm getting this video feed of raw packets coming in so I can watch the high definition video. And that's coming to me probably from some content delivery network. In fact, it's definitely coming from a content delivery network provided by Amazon, because Amazon is the partner for Formula One, and so you get to see this content in high definition on your phone because it's being broadcast to you. But on top of that, there are multiple layers of other services that you need to consider. For example, the statistics or the social media integration. Those things are not coming from the same source as the video stream. They're coming from another location, more than likely some sort of big compute engine at the back end, like a AWS statistical analytics environment that's pulling in all the information from all the cars and drivers and giving you insights. But that sort of processing power can't happen at the edge. It has to happen far away because you need to have the big compute for that. But the video is pretty easy. Video streaming is relatively easy and relatively lightweight from a compute point of view nowadays. It's just pushing packets. So those two things, to divide them up, is an example of why I think it's important we provide the right set of services in the right location. So you ask about the idea of delivering the real-time demands. The video feed is the key. Like in this example, I want to see the video, and it needs to be low latency, responsive to my view. At the same time, I need information that's going to be sent to me, but it doesn't have the same sort of demands from a network latency point of view. The statistics can come through a couple of milliseconds delayed. It doesn't really matter, but the video needs to be real time. And this is the same thing we see with virtual reality or augmented reality and this whole thing of the metaverse, so to speak, because our brains consume things in real time. And if there's any sort of delay, we kind of question it and we go, what happened there? And so for a video feed, it's one thing, but for information, we want to be informed at this moment, and our brains demand it. For example, our brains can, from our eye to our brain, we can actually recognize things within about 13 milliseconds. And so if something is a little bit outside of that, and actually the statistics have been showing recently that anything above 20 milliseconds in terms of virtual reality causes the person to feel a little bit nauseated. They're not quite sure what's going on, but they're not 100% in focus, so to speak. Mm. And so that demand of having something real time is not just a feeling in one's brain. It's one that feels comfort. And of course, as you deliver products to people, you want them to feel that comfort level. Otherwise, they won't use the product. And so that's really important in terms of the real-time demands. Now, of course, then that has impacts on the network. We talk about 5G being a faster radio frequency, a faster infrastructure, a newer way of deploying infrastructure, which is in itself worth 10 podcasts in another conversation. But that is driving that faster consumption model. And if you look at every evolution of networks, it's always been the case. How do I get access to information faster? At the same time, edge computing is going to help us provide that consumption so that when I am on a 5G network and I want to access that CDN video or that information from that video feed quickly, rather than going from my 5G device all the way to the other side of the internet to consume that, I'm actually going to go very local. It's going to be shared or delivered via a content network to me locally, so that I don't have to go and make that request and get hundreds of milliseconds return speed rather than get down to 10s and 20s. And so therefore, it makes it easier for me to understand, consume without that frustration or confusion of delay. So yeah, that's why I think it's really interesting to think about, because the more and more we consume services, and those services are high definition, higher quality, we need to provide that functionality closer and closer to the user. And it's only going to be driven by more and more of this demand from people like ourselves who we demand access to quality information up close and easy.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And that demand is only going to increase. And you said at the very beginning of the podcast that you're currently in charge of developing a security strategy for 5G. So I've got to ask, what excites you about the future, and also the role that Zscaler will play in that future? Because there's so much going on now, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I guess the best way to say it is if I start with what Zscaler is as a company, we mentioned before we provide this inline security solution between the end user and the source and the destination, anywhere that source may be and anywhere that the destination may be. That idea is is predicated on the idea of least privilege, or as the buzzword in the industry is right now, zero trust. So ensuring that the right user gets the right application, or the right application gets the right application, and vice versa. And that's really important to what we see around 5G. 5G in itself is a much faster network, yes. But one of the coolest things about it is it's moving away from these monolithic infrastructures that would be very centralized in a data center or a set of data centers from a telco provider, And now we're moving them into things like distributed ecosystems. So if you think about it, 5G is taking 4G, which is very much like a traditional data center, to 5G, which is very much like a cloud distributed ecosystem. So you can have workloads and functions distributed around the world wherever the users are, very much as Zscaler is right now. So Zscaler is able to provide this security over the internet, and 5G is extending the internet and other networks into to connect to each other. So for us, we see this, well, let's do this in terms of, well, how do we provide that zero trust control in that extended layer within 5G? And so I mentioned before about granular controls. For us, it's about authorizing the right source to get to the right destination, and then providing those right controls for that right source to get to the right destination. And 5G is really an extension of that, but more so in a few different ways. So we see it in terms of you or I, Neil, consuming an application. It could be an application in a private 5G ecosystem. It could be in a public 5G ecosystem. It could be distributed in multiple places, but making sure that you get access and I don't is critical to that deployment. Conversely, then we look at how we provide controls in terms of what the 5G infrastructure is. And I mentioned it's going to a distributed function system so that authorization, session management, all that fun stuff will no longer be in one big box in a data center. It's going to be distributed across the cloud or various locations. So how do we ensure all those communications are secure and providing the right protection for that information? So there's a lot of areas and many more beyond this that is really cool. But what I like the most about it, as I kind of alluded to, that it's a cloud-like service. So 5G really is saying, well, all I need to have in my building is the antenna. I don't need to have all the compute managing all the accounts and everything else. I just need to have the antenna. All that other stuff can happen in some various clouds. And we see that from the likes of AWS. And in fact, AWS released a service beginning of this year, end of last year, called Private 5G from AWS. And literally all they do is they send you some antennas and some SIM cards, and everything else is managed in their cloud. And we see that being critical in terms of how the future of applications will be accessed, because, well, all you need to have on premises is some antennas to connect people or devices, and then you need to put your applications where you need to put your applications, which is anywhere. And that falls perfectly into that distributed model that Zscaler has been building for the last 15 years of providing security anywhere the user is, anywhere the application is. So it's a really fun time to be playing in the space. A lot of fun indeed.
It really is. And speaking of fun, I always like to end the podcast with a little bit of fun and ask the guests to leave everyone listening with a personal touch of inspiration by sharing maybe a book that has inspired them or a go-to song or piece of music that is important to them. But the big question is, what are you going to leave us with today? And is there a story to accompany your choice?
So I think I've got to give you two books, at least that I've read, one that I'm reading right now, one I've just finished reading, and they're both kind of nerdy. The one I read recently was a review of the 90s classic arcade game NBA Jam. And not in terms of the game itself, but actually the development. So how they managed to develop from the ground up, all the challenges with getting the right size files into the chipsets on the firmware, all these things. It's a really great read, actually. It was an NBA Jam by Ryan Alley. And the book I'm reading right now is The World According to Physics by Jim Al-Kahali. Highly recommend it. Really, really cool book. Not complicated to read, actually relatively short, but really interesting to see how the world is from a pure physics point of view. So I would say those are my two books to leave you with, and I can certainly make some recommendations on music as well if you'd like.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, well, there's two great books there for everyone to get their geek on, but if there's a song to add to our Spotify playlist, what would you add to that?
It's got to be Beastie Boys, Make Some Noise.
Oh, man, what a tune.
There's something in one of the second verses about taking a look at yourself. I forget the exact wording of it, but it's brilliant. And I love that song. So it's a great way to get motivated and get things going.
Awesome. I'll make sure that goes on our Spotify playlist. And for everyone listening that wants to find out more information about everything we talked about today, what's the best starting point to find Zscaler online, and equally contact your team if anyone's got any questions or want to carry on that conversation?
Yeah. So zscaler.com, pretty easy to find, or zscaler.com, depending on the whether you're Antipodean or UK based. But you can also we can reach out to the team from that website, or you can also contact me on LinkedIn under Nathan Howe. So I'm happy to have a conversation with any of your listeners.
Well, I think we covered so much in a short amount of time there, from security service edge to the events of the last 2 years and where we're heading. So much I've loved about it. And I'd love to stay in touch with you, maybe get you back on the podcast later in the year, see how things are going. But more than anything, just thank you for taking the time to share your story today. Some great insights, not to mention 2 books and a great track for our Spotify playlist. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to the next one. We have lots more to talk about.
Wow, what a great guy. I'm going to have Beastie Boys earworm in my head for the rest of the day. And 2 great books that I'll be checking out too, not to mention an inspirational story and his passion for technology and how it's transforming businesses, industries, indeed our entire world. I think all that came across brilliantly. But you've heard a discussion with me and Nathan Howe from Zscaler today. But now I want to keep this conversation going by bringing you into the conversation. Yes, I mean you passively listening on your commute to work or wherever you are. I want to get those ideas and insights and experiences out of your head and shared with everyone listening all over the world. And to do that, it can be as simple as sending me a quick email, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Tell me your experiences and what you agreed with and what you disagreed with today. And equally, you can hit me up on the DMs, as those cool kids would say, by getting me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter @NeilC.Hughes. But don't just hit follow or connect. Send a little personal note. Tell me you listen to the podcast and I'll separate you from the follow back gang and the spammers and bring you into my circle of trust. How does that sound? Well, keep those messages coming in, questions, whatever it might be, and I'll return again tomorrow. I'll be waiting patiently in your podcast feed with another interview. But thank you so much for joining me today, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.